Today I want to teach you basic photography, all that you need to know under photography in basic terms, the fundamentals that you need. What if I told you that this is very simple than what people may think it is, because it's the first time you're hearing about photography, or probably you were introduced to photography and you held a camera and felt so daunting. It's understandable. It's so understandable. But what if I told you that I could teach you in just a couple of minutes so you understand the basics in photography, and when you get yourself another camera one day, you can easily pull off the images that you've so desired to always take. So without much ado, let us get right into it. Just like being a newbie and everything, if you had the opportunity to be taught like a toddler or, a kid, the first time you're introduced to whatever subject it is, if you're given tuition from the ground, it's very easy to grasp all that there is. And that's exactly what we're going to do today, so that you understand photography in basic terms, nothing whatsoever to bombard your mind to make things so difficult. Let's just look at it. When I get hold of a camera and I'm taking a picture with it, the first thing I'm definitely going to consider and set is my ISO. ISO is simply the sensitivity of the image sensor of the camera to light. And in any given scenario, that's the first thing I'm going to consider to set. So in simple terms, as I said before, the sensitivity of the image sensor to light is what the ISO is all about. So the higher value in ISO, the more sensitive the image sensor is. And in reverse, the smaller the ISO number, the less sensitive the image sensor is. So you might be wondering, why don't I just as well crank up my ISO in any given scenario? But it's actually the opposite, because you're going to have to keep your ISO as low as possible, because the more the ISO in value, the more grain, the more noise that you're going to introduce in your images. So to give you a clear understanding about what I mean by the grains and why you should keep your ISO as low as possible, this is an example of what I took off a water bottle, and let's look at the values as they change. So here's ISO 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600, 3200, and 6400, 12800, and 25,600. ISO is the reason why camera body prices fluctuate so much. In a cheap camera, you can go up to ISO 800 to ISO 1600 before you notice noise in the pictures that you take with it. While on the flip side, expensive camera bodies can go up to 3200 of an ISO all the way to 6400 and even beyond before you notice some grains. And sometimes, in most cases, the images that you capture at such high ISOs can still be usable. So in simple terms, you pay more to get more light. Most of the time, I stay at ISO 100 when I'm outdoors shooting in the sun, or sometimes 200 when the need be. And when I get indoors, I bump it up to ISO 400, 800, 1600. On my EOS 6D, ISO 3200 is quite good. I can use it because it's a full frame image sensor sitting in the camera, and yeah, it's quite usable, and that's where I actually get to when I'm shooting with natural light most of the time. So let's just recap on ISO. ISO is simply the sensitivity of your image sensor to light. The higher the ISO number, the more light you get in, but the more noise that you're also going to introduce into your images. So try as much as possible, for the most part, to keep your ISO low. The next point to talk about is aperture. Aperture is simply the opening in your lens, and you can actually see it inside happening, where the blades in the lens opens and closes to dilate and constrain the hole in the lens, which allows in the light, just as I said before. And that hole size is your aperture. With aperture, things can get a little bit confusing, because the smaller the aperture value, the bigger the hole and the more light that enters the camera. And on the other hand, the larger the aperture number, the smaller the hole and the less light that enters the camera. And these values are written in f-stop. So the next time you see f2.8, f4.0, f5.6, f3.5, all these are related to aperture. If we look at the kit lens that normally camera bodies comes with, especially the Canon camera bodies, you're definitely going to find f3.5 to 5.6. But the largest aperture value, which means you're going to constrain the hole in the lens as much as possible to the limit, you're going to get it all the way to f38. So 3.5 all the way to f38. That's the range within that lens, that kit lens that you normally find Canon camera bodies coming with. For more expensive lenses, like what I have over here sitting on the table, this is Sigma 85mm 1.4, which means the largest hole that you can get on this lens is 1.4, which makes the light intake very huge, and that can also be a determinant when it comes to the prices of lenses that you can purchase. So with aperture again, the larger the hole, the more light there is, and the smaller the hole, the less light there is. The lower the number, the more light there is, and the higher the number, the less light there is with aperture. One very important thing about the aperture is that it controls what we call the depth of field. So I will kind of ask you to forget about what we just spoke about earlier about aperture, though it's very important with aperture. Light intake, it measures the amount of light that enters the camera. But let us look at depth of field, which is the most important thing about aperture, and this is how we use it. Depth of field is pretty simple. It is the amount of what is in focus behind and before the spot where you focused on. So here again with the aperture values, the smaller the number, the thinner the plane of focus is, and the larger the number, the larger the plane of focus is. So here I have a ruler next to my lens so that you can see the details of what is in focus and what is not as the numbers change. So here's a shot at f1.4, f2, f2.8, f4, f5.6, f8, f11, f16. So you can see that as the number went up, the depth of field did as well. So in any given scenario, the first I'm going to set is my ISO based on that scene and the lighting consistency and the conditions that are affecting the light. Then the second thing I'll do is to set my aperture, considering what I'm focusing on, if I need more depth of field or a shallow depth of field. So if I'm shooting one person, or let's say a simple portrait outdoor, I'm definitely going to shoot at a very shallow depth of field. So for instance, on this lens, which can go all the way up to f1.4, I'm definitely going to shoot at f1.4 all the way to, let's say, f2.8. That's where I'm going to stay so I can isolate my subject so much more with a very shallow depth of field. But with larger groups, let's say people standing in a row, some of them standing behind and before, I'm going to use a deep depth of field, which is a large aperture number, let's say f4, f5.6, all the way up, so that I can get a lot of things in focus, and all the people over there are definitely going to be in focus because I have a larger plane of focus. In another instance is if I'm shooting a landscape and I have a tree in front of me and mountains behind it, I'm going to definitely crank it up to f16 to get a lot of things in focus. So no matter what distance it is, a larger aperture number, which means a smaller hole, is going to give me a lot of distance in focus. So in recap, the aperture is the size of the opening in your lens. The lower the f-stop, more light. The higher the f-stop, less light. But remember, the aperture controls depth of field, which is more important when it comes to creating an image. Low f-stop, shallow depth of field or small depth of field, and high f-stop, large depth of field or deep depth of field. Pretty simple, right? The last thing we're going to talk about is shutter speed. Shutter speed is pretty simple. It's the amount of time, measured in seconds, that your shutter remains open. In other words, shutter speed is measured in fractions of a second. So you're going to see values like 1/50th of a second, 1/200th of a second, 1/400th of a second, and it goes on and on all the way to sometimes 1/8000th of a second. And the highest value you can go depends on what camera body you are using. And to the other side, you can slow your shutter speed all the way to 1 second, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, and sometimes even 30 seconds. So while shutter speed controls the amount of time the shutter remains open, it also controls motion blur. So from more motion blur all the way to where moving subjects can be frozen in action. So the slowest shutter speed or slow shutter speeds can be shot with a tripod, having the camera being mounted on a tripod where you have a large space. For instance, if you are using streaks of light in an image to do something that we call light painting, you can have your camera sitting on a tripod all the way to the slowest shutter speed that you can go with, let's say 30 seconds. Hit it and wait for 30 seconds. Here, the shutter is going to remain open for as long as you've set it. So here, in our case, 30 seconds, and it's going to stay open, amass all the light. And here, you're going to find moving cars creating these streaks of light there in the image, and it looks so pleasant. And on the other side, when you want to freeze motion, shutter speed is what can help you accomplish that. So let's say fast moving cars, sports, soccer players jumping in the air, and want to freeze their motion with a very fast shutter speed, you can grab the image and make it look as if they are suspended. That's with the footballers. And with the cars, you can grab the image and it will look as if the car was actually parked. And this can be achieved with a very fast shutter speed. When I'm shooting portraits, I don't want any motion blur. I want everything to be crisp and sharp. And so with a very fast shutter speed, depending on how much light I have, I'm going to stay at a fast shutter speed and grab these images to ensure that my portraits are tacked sharp. So here I'm going to stay anywhere between 1/200th of a second to 1/500th of a second. But in instances where my subjects are walking fast or running or, there's a little bit of motion in there, I'm gonna bump it up to 1/800th of a second or 1/1600th of a second. But in low light situations, I make my subject stand still as much as they can, and I will shoot at 1/100th of a second. That's the lowest I will go. I wouldn't go lower than that because I'll be introducing motion blur here in the shots, which I don't really like in my portraits. When shooting sports, you're gonna wanna be in the 1/800 range to the 1/1000 range. And here, the whole idea is that when your subject is in motion as fast as they possibly are going, you're gonna wanna freeze them with a very fast shutter speed value. So the total basics of shutter speed is that slower shutter speed, more motion blur, faster shutter speed, less motion blur. So that's it. I'm going to put all this together. So when I'm in a given scenario, the first thing that I'm going to consider again is my ISO. I'm going to keep it as low as possible so that I don't introduce a lot of noise. But if it's in a low light situation and I cannot produce any light of any sort, I'm going to bump it up a little bit, but still have it in mind that I may be introducing some noise in the shot. And the second thing I'm going to set is my aperture, having my subject in mind and what I want to have in focus before and after my subject. And then the third, I'm going to decide how much motion blur that I want and what I don't want, and consider that to set my shutter speed. So a quick scene scenario is that if my environment or my space is very dark or in a low light situation, that's where I find myself, I'm going to look at three things here. All the three things that we've spoken about can control the amount of light that you let into the camera. So the first thing I'm going to consider is my shutter speed. Then after I've set my shutter speed based on how much motion blur and what I don't want in it, I'm going to consider my aperture next and see what I wanted in focus or what I don't want in focus. Then the last thing that I'm going to consider is my ISO, of course. That's why if I've gotten to the point where I cannot move anymore with the shutter speed and the aperture values, and I still want to increase the sensitivity of my image sensor to light, I'm going to bump it up a little bit more to the point where that I don't want to go anymore, because I will be considering the grains and I don't want to risk that in any way having noise in my shots. And in another scenario where I have too much light, or when I shot my first take, I realized that the image was too bright, what I'm going to consider first of all is to lower my ISO as much as I can. If I've gotten my ISO as low as it can go, the next thing that I'm going to consider is to raise my shutter speed. Here, unless my subject is in motion and I want to keep that motion in there, I'm not going to bump it up all the way to, let's say, 1/1000th of a second. There's no way I'm going to go all the way there. Probably I need some more motion in the shot. But if I don't want more motion, I'm going to crank it all the way up. But know that it's also going to affect the amount of light that you're getting here. So if the amount of light is still too much, then I'm going to go to my aperture. But sometimes, in most cases, I barely touch my aperture because I mostly set it at a very, sweet spot where I'm considering how much focus I have in front of and beyond or after my spot of focus. So these are the things that I want you to consider the next time you grab your camera, and you're going to be set up for a good start. So that's all that you need to understand about basic photography, and it just transcends beyond all this. But you need to understand this, practice more, and you're going to get much more experienced as the years go by, with more practice, of course. So thank you very much for watching this video to the very end. If you enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up. If you learned something, please don't be selfish. Share it to your friends across all social media platforms. And of course, turn on the post notification button so that you will be notified anytime I upload a new video over here onto my YouTube channel. So until the next video, have a wonderful day. See ya.